pension. It is absolute continuity. It's simply leaving things as they are. Obviously, the review that the Honourable Gentleman proposes in Amendment 6 would be a review of the whole policy, which would, of course, apply to all existing pensioners as well. And clearly, the single-tier pensioners will initially be a very small proportion of the people affected by this policy. Now, quite properly, as we talked about this morning, the question was raised about whether we tell people whether or not their pensions are not going to be uprated if they go to certain countries. And obviously I was confident that we did, and I happen to have to hand the information that we provide. When people are planning to go to retire and ask us for a statement and ask what they're going to get, we issue them with leaflet DWP 40, which goes out with the state pension statement, a leaflet called Your State Pension Statement Explained. And I can confirm that on page 21 there is a section headed UK state pension payments outside the UK, which explains that whilst you can get your UK state pension anywhere you live, if you live outside the UK and get a UK state pension, you will not get annual increases unless you live in, and then the various categories are EEA country, Switzerland, or a country that has an agreement with the UK to allow these increases. So we're quite clear that unless one of these is the case, you will not get increases. In similar terms, when we issue the claim pack 4 months before people reach state pension age, we issue them with form DWP 23, and that also has a section headed UK state pension payments outside the UK, has similar text to the one I just read out. And it also points out that when people come back to the UK, it says, and I quote, if you live in a country where your UK state pension is not increased, your UK state pension may be increased for the time when you visit the UK or countries where the annual increase is paid. So at two very important points, when people ask for a forecast or a statement, as we now call them, or when people are actually told 4 months before state pension age about their pension, we do flag up this important information. It is also on the gov.uk website. It's on form PM2 or leaflet PM2, the General Guide to State Pensions, and it is in leaflet NI 138, Social Security Abroad, issued by our colleagues at HMRC. So if you ask for a leaflet about Social Security Abroad, you get this information. So we do seek to provide this information quite extensively. Now, in terms of those who are abroad, it's important to understand that two countries dominate the people we're talking to. I understand that just short of 3 in 4 of the people we're talking about are in Canada or Australia. And it was suggested that the Canadian and Australian governments would like us to increase pensions in those cases. And indeed they would. And there is a reason for that, which is that they have, as part of their system, means-tested state pension systems. And therefore, if we were to increase state pensions in Canada and Australia, which is nearly 3/4 of the people we're talking about, that would be a saving to the Canadian and Australian exchequer at the extent the cost to the British taxpayer, not necessarily, therefore, in those cases, to the benefit of the British citizen living abroad. There would be British citizens whose incomes would be above the level where they qualify for the means-tested pension in those countries, but of course those are not the folk who people are most concerned about, the folk who have nothing else to live on. Those are, by definition, the folk who have something else to live on. As my old friend for Plymouth Sutton pointed out, people will go abroad and they will have...
And Devonport.
And the people of Devonport will also go abroad with occupational pensions, with savings and so on. And so it's the whole picture that matters. So just to stress that in the two... yes, certainly. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I thank the Honourable Minister for giving way. I've actually spoken on this issue in the Chamber, and I'm really grateful to hear the explanation from the Minister about the differential between means-tested benefit in the countries where constituents, ex-constituents of mine have written to me about. It's very helpful to get that on the record, so I thank the Minister for that.
Very grateful to my honourable friend. And clearly that is true of the countries, it's not true in all of the countries, and as I say, if you have other pension income you may not get the means-tested pension, but then of course if you have other pension income it's only part of your total income that's not being uprated. I think also I would point out that it would be mistaken to think that what happens is that people do their working life in Britain, retire and draw a pension, and then emigrate. In fact, the committee might be startled to learn that of the UK pensioners overseas, the proportion who moved as pensioners, I'm tempted to have a sweepstake at this point, is 2%. So only 2% of British pensioners overseas moved as pensioners. All the rest moved of working age. Now, clearly, some of them just before drawing a state pension, but quite a number well before drawing a state pension. And this is quite important because countries such as Australia have in the past sought, quite properly, to recruit skilled British workers of significantly below pension age. So it's an incorrect picture of what's going on here to imagine that every British pensioner overseas worked all their life in Britain, retired just before or at pension age, and is now on a pension. Quite a significant number of British pensioners overseas, for example, went to Australia when they were in, for example, their 30s or 40s, to do a job as a nurse or whatever it happens to be, and lived a significant part of their life in Australia. So again, they will have been, in just a second, they will have been building up pension rights in the Australian system. They will only have part of their pension income based on the British system, and it's only that part that is then not uprated.
So can my honourable friend just clarify then, what he's saying is that they will have ended up also probably paying into the Canadian or the Australian, or for that matter the American national insurance system as well, whatever the equivalent is of that. So they would end up by receiving monies from that, and also they'd be receiving potentially monies from the British government too.
Yes, Mrs May, my honourable friend is entirely correct.
Right.
So again, there is clearly a diversity of circumstances here. There's no question about that. But it simply isn't the case that we are talking about 1 million people, all of whom are wholly dependent on the British state pension, who would all benefit if we were to uprate it. It is much more mixed pattern than that. Now, to be fair, if I were the opposition and the Shadow Chancellor told me I couldn't spend any money, but I wanted to sound sympathetic, I would have asked for a review. I mean, I think we understand where this amendment comes from. But I do think the Honourable Member for Edinburgh East earlier on, Mrs Main, suggested that I had been sympathetic in the past to this group. In fact, I'm sympathetic today to this group. I understand the point that they make. She mentioned an amendment I tabled in 2004, which was less than perfectly drafted, because I think it would have uprated everyone in the world's pensions, constantly. So I didn't quite get that right. I think the fiscal environment in 2004 was a tiny bit different. And just to give a feel for figures, the cost of simply uprating from now on and dealing with the non-uprating that had happened to date, in other words, so from now on you pay the uprating, our latest estimate is £695 million a year. Now again, there is a danger when you do pensions that you stop noticing zeros, but £695 million is a very serious sum of money, and as I've indicated, some of that would not even benefit the people for whom it's intended. So there is also the risk, of course, that if we were to do that, given that these cases have indeed been to the courts, they've been to the House of Lords, they've been to the European courts, and the courts in each case have found in the UK government's favour that what we're doing is lawful, and so on, there is a danger that as soon as we said we should uprate going forward, someone would say, but hang on a minute, I retired 20 years ago. Not only should you pay me the pension that I would now be getting if it had always been uprated, but I want all the money for the period since I left the country, all those years in the interim period when it wasn't uprated. Because if it's right to uprate it now, why didn't you uprate it last year and the year before and the year before? And we are talking billions of pounds. So there is a real risk to the Exchequer with this one. And my worry would be if we accept Amendment 6, Mrs May, and we say, well, what harm could a review do? We simply raise expectations in a way that would disappoint. And the Honourable Member for Edinburgh East said, I've been sympathetic in the past and now I'm somewhere adjacent to the levers of power, I wouldn't put it any stronger than that, that I'd let people down by failing to deliver. And I just want to make it absolutely clear, all three political parties, probably all four if our colleague was here, went into the 2010 election with manifestos which promised this group of people precisely nothing. And I think it's important to put that on the record, that nobody who voted in the 2010 general election and took the trouble to read our manifestos should have thought that anyone was promising them action on this point. I didn't, my manifesto didn't, and I don't think anybody else did. So whilst I understand the fact that, having been sympathetic as I remain to their case over the years, I was quite explicit when I asked for people's vote that I wasn't promising action on this point, and I don't think any of us was. And the worry with this review is we just sort of raise expectations again, and we've seen what happens when that happens, and I would be very reluctant to do that. We've talked about, just to get a sense of scale here, the majority of the money that we pay in state pensions outside the UK is in non-frozen rate countries. So we pay around £3 billion a year outside the UK, and about £2 billion of that is in non-frozen frozen rate countries. So the majority of money we pay outside the country is uprated. But clearly, as we've discovered, for historic reasons, it isn't in some cases. It was suggested that a review would settle this matter once and for all. I think it's naive to think that it would settle this matter once and for all, because if the review found that there wasn't a significant exchequer saving or something like that, we'd be back again. There'll be another campaign, another set of posters. It won't settle matters once and for all. I think what we owe to these pensioners is consistency and clarity of legislation. The position has been the same under successive governments over a matter of decades. This bill for the new single-tier pensioners proposes exact continuity with the regime that's already been in place. And on that basis, I don't believe that the time cost of doing a review would actually achieve anything. There's a lot of issues that such a review could look at, but as has already been pointed out, arguments about, well, people go overseas so they don't use the NHS. Of course, you could change these rules on that basis, and then, of course, you've got no guarantee that folk won't come back and use the NHS anyway, as has been debated earlier on. So I think some of these arguments about some hypothetical long-term savings are a bit thin. The basic principle, yes.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman Minister for giving way. Just as he was speaking there about the potential benefits or otherwise, and I take precisely his point about having no guarantee that pensioners wouldn't then come back to use the NHS. Am I right in remembering that there was a study undertaken on behalf of the International Consortium of Pensioners by an economics consultancy? Would the Minister care to comment on that? Because I remember at the time the Minister analysed it quite closely.
Minister.
Yes, I believe that an organisation called Oxford Economics were paid by, as I recall, the International Consortium of British Pensioners, and came up with a report that the ICBP felt supported their case, interestingly enough. I've read that report in full, and it makes some pretty heroic assumptions about future behaviour. There's some polling and so on. And I think, it's highly speculative, would be a charitable version. In a sense, we don't know how people's behaviour would change, but as we've discussed, a lot of people, for example, have already retired perhaps many years ago, or have moved many years ago. And so, for example, even if we thought there was some impact on movement, there would be a huge amount of dead weight in economic terms, which is to say you'd pay extra pension to people who had absolutely no intention of coming back anyway, in the assumption you'd save a bit of money from people who might otherwise have done and then didn't. I mean, it's very unconvincing, I think. Scratching his head. So I think stroking his head. I do apologise. Stroking his head. So, Mrs. Mayne, I think this is. I think I've lost count, but I think it's the fourth review we've been asked for so far. I'm not convinced that this one adds any more than the first three, to be honest. Our position is clear. I think clarity at this point is what people need. Recognise the concerns of the groups affected, but at £700 million and a possible knock-on to billions, if backdating was then to be pursued, I don't believe it's a priority for the British government. So on that basis, I think it would be wrong to have a review to raise expectations and write that Clause 20 should stand part of the bill.
Thank you. Madam Chair, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Once again, I thank the Minister for that response. I was struck by what I took to be the Minister's position, that he remains sympathetic to this case. I wasn't quite clear whether his view was that if financial circumstances allowed, he would wish to uprate these pensions. That was a little bit ambiguous, but I struck by his comments on the Oxford Economics report as well, which from the little the Minister said about it, I take him to be saying that the assumptions about movement, in terms of that it would encourage pensioners who might otherwise not be able to fulfil their desire to move abroad, it might otherwise encourage them to do so. And it seems to be the Minister's case on that study, and I remember this at the time from the Minister's response, is that those assumptions aren't credible enough for the government to base policy on, and I think that is not an entirely unfair position. I did have one question, he talked about raising expectations unfairly. Is the Minister's view, as I take it, that such a review would raise up expectations unfairly? And the Minister was also very clear, I think, in his view that such an analysis, well, I wasn't quite clear, I wasn't clear if the Minister's view was that such an analysis was difficult to undertake. I think actually what the Minister was saying was that such a study would be entirely possible on a cross-departmental basis, but actually the Minister's concerned about consistency and not raising the expectations of pensioners in this position unfairly, and I don't think that is. I don't think that's something we should dismiss out of hand. There's absolutely a question of expectations. I was struck also by the Minister noting that only 2% of British pensioners moved overseas as pensioners, a striking figure. The Minister then went on to say that, of course, a significant number probably moved just before retiring. It'd be interesting, is that the case? Is there a figure on that? But certainly I take the Minister's point that a significant number are moving well before retirement, or have moved well before retirement. Of course, it still remains the case that they will have made their contributions into the UK system, and the issue of uprating for them remains. I have to say, I wasn't sure that my honourable friend, the member Fred and Rees, actually quoted a 2004 amendment. I wasn't even aware that there was a 2004 amendment that the Minister had put down. So that's full disclosure indeed from the Minister. And of course, it's not a crime to change one's mind. I say what I wasn't quite clear from in the Minister's response was whether he changed his mind on the principle, that he no longer in principle supported the uprating of frozen pensions, or whether his view was that while he retained that principle, financial circumstances, given the continuing deterioration of the economy, was the point. So I wasn't 100% sure on that. And say our amendment, as laid down, would call on the government to do a cross-departmental study of the costs and benefits of uprating pensions to the Treasury, very much a financially focused measure. But I do take the government's point about that uprating this would potentially have a significant financial cost. And in those circumstances, and having listened to the Minister's reply, while I would welcome further clarity on the Minister's position on the principle of this matter, at this stage and going forward, don't intend to push this to a vote.
Right. Is it your pleasure that the amendment be withdrawn?
Aye.
Amendment by leave withdrawn. The question is that clause 20 stand part of the bill.